Hello, welcome to the Online Strength Coach podcast, episode 85, Volumes and Skill Learning for Powerlifting. Hello, and welcome to episode 85 of the Online Strength Coach podcast. Today's question comes from the comment section of episode 84. It comes from Michael Cowan. Hey mate, volume and frequency seems to be the craze at the minute. What would you think would be the highest working reps you should do in a workout, for example, at 70, 80 and 90%? Also, what do you think about doing very light singles, examples like 50% of your 1RM 2 times a day to ingrain motor patterns? I remember Dr. Mike Isratel said the SRA curve for technique only takes hours, and after that technique can start to decrease. Okay, thanks very much for the question, Mike. So, two-part question, really. First of all, the volumes that you should utilize on a day-to-day basis in your workouts for the power lifts. We're going to use this as as stated in the title, we're going to just cover powerlifting in this podcast because there's too many other factors in other sports that will confound the frequency and the volumes you should utilize within your strength training. It very much needs to be case by case when it comes to sports training and how to integrate strength training into your sports training. And for weightlifting, I'm not really enough of an expert to speak to be honest, as regards the optimal percentages or the kind of the limits of the volumes you should utilize at those percentages. Okay, so it really does depend. 1 on the lift, 2 on the lifter, 3 on the frequency of lifting, so the program, and 4 in the context of the block and the annual plan. To answer this question, I'm just going to front this before I go into more detail. There is no correct answer to this question. There's too many individual variances you need to take into account, and it also depends on the goal of the training cycle and what you're doing at the time. So if you're looking for a nice easy 25 reps at 70% is the ideal amount, and 30 and 15 reps at 80% is the ideal amount, then that's not where you're going to get. Okay, so if we look at the example of a 70%, so just off the bat, you can perform a larger volume in the lower percentage range and not create an overreach. So that's the first thing. And then the next thing we need to look at is within the week. How does that look? So for the squat, for example, if there's only one workout, then we can do a lot more volume in all the percent ranges than if there's 4 squat workouts. So we need to factor in the frequency into this decision-making process. So to take the examples, if we look at something like a 70% in a single workout, if we're not doing other sets, so for example, if we'll keep this real easy just now. So we're saying in a workout we're not going to do any kind of pyramid, and we're not going to do some volume at 60, some volume at 70%, some volume at 75, some volume at 80%, which would more likely be the case when we do this a kind of a program that's spread across the week, the volume spread across the week, using different variations of the exercises. It's highly likely that the intensity of the volume or the meaningful volumes, if you take the Chico's approach, is anything over 50 to 100% is a meaningful volume that needs recording. Other approaches I might have looked at in the past would have been something like 70 to 100%, but I'm now including anything from 50% upwards into my recording of my volumes for the week. So we just say it's flat loading. So for example, a 70% workout, something like a 5 sets of 5 or a 25 reps in that session at that intensity probably represents close to a good stimulus that's not going to create too much fatigue. So the likes of a 5 sets of 10 that's more of an overreaching stimulus. That's something that's going to create lag on your recovery. So if you do a 5 sets of 10 on a back squat, or you do 5 sets of 10 on a deadlift, it's going to take anywhere from 4 to 7 days to totally recover from that session. Depending on the lifter, it could be 3 to 4 days, and some lifters could find it takes 7 to 9 days to recover from that kind of overreach. That sort of volume is going to create too much recovery to make a high frequency of training viable, because it's going to there's too much mechanical damage going on, there's too much muscle damage, there's too much fatigue within the session. So within that session, the lifter's going to utilize incorrect technique almost undoubtedly by set 4 or 5. If it's a more complex lift, such as a squat variation or a deadlift variation, attention to the details probably going to become less. That means they might, in a squat where they normally would stand up chest first out of the hole, like an easy example, they might stand up bum first out of the hole, creating more stress in the lower back. That's going to cause concentric eccentric demand on the lower back, and that concentric eccentric demand on that musculature or on those muscles is going to cause DOMs. It's going to cause muscle damage, which is going to cause DOMs, and that DOMs is going to take a while to clear. It's not going to clear in 2 days. It's probably going to clear in 4, 5, 6 days. And it's going to take even longer if you're doing a higher frequency of approach. So the kind of minimum frequency people will utilize within a high frequency training program for powerlifting will be 2 days. I think from 2 to 7, depending on the program and the lifter. That means that lifter who's done that 5 sets of 10 workout at 70% is going to be training that same movement or a variation of that same movement in a minimum of 48 hours time, or it could even be 24 hours time, which means that they're going to put more fatigue, more load on those muscles or on those joints that have already been taxed with an overreach stimulus, which means it's going to put a delayed effect on the recovery. And this is the sort of scenario that leads to an overreach injury. This is the sort of scenario that's going to lead to a torn pec in a bench press, going to lead to knee issues, going to lead to lower back issues, going to lead to shoulder issues, when the volume or the intensities are too high within the session for the intensities and the frequencies being used. So first and foremost, you got to look at the frequency you're utilizing. If you're utilizing a 1 day a week frequency, then you can pretty much go ham. You need to do something pretty ludicrous to create an overreach scenario with a week to recover from it, outside of using really poor technique. Within a 2 day a week scenario, you've got to be a little bit smarter. 3 days a week, you need to be even more smarter, and 4 days a week, then when you really need we're getting into territory there where we either need the coach present, or we need the athlete or the coach dealing with the athlete to have a really good objective and subjective knowledge of that athlete. So they've got training logs from a year, 2 years of training, or they're keeping tabs on recovery, either through like a wellness questionnaire, like a subjective wellness questionnaire. They can be utilizing something like heart rate variability, or different range of motion tests to assess that athlete's readiness to train. If you haven't got the knowledge, if you haven't got the experiential base as a coach or as an athlete doing this kind of training, then when you start pushing the boat out to 3, 4, 5 times a week, then you're starting to enter unknown territory. And you might find you get away with it for a year, 2 years, 3 years, but eventually it's going to go sideways. I can pretty much guarantee at some stage with that kind of frequency, if you don't know what you're doing, you're gonna hit some kind of wall, or it's going to be an issue, you're going to get fucked up at some stage, basically, almost guaranteed. Whereas the margin for error at 1 to 2 days a week frequency is quite easy, and then the 3 day a week's a little bit more challenging, but it can be overcome. So, for example, if we were saying an athlete or a lifter was on a 2 day a week routine, then if we're training at 70%, then something from like a 15 to 25 rep volume load for that session at a 70% intensity is probably going to produce a nice stimulus that isn't going to create too much of an overreach. If that athlete does 3 sets of 5 at 70%, it will have an effect on their strength. If they do that twice a week, they'll have a stimulus on their strength levels. It's low enough that they can recover from quite well. The intensity per set is low enough that they can utilize correct technique through the entire exercise within the context of the week. It's probably like a moderate sort of load on the week. They'll be fully recovered by the time they get to the next session. Within a 3 day a week scenario, then at 70%, we're probably looking 10 to 20 reps at that sort of rep range for the same sort of criteria to be fulfilled. When we start looking at higher percentages, so we'll start looking at 80%. If we're not performing any lighter volumes, we're just only working at 80%, then a 1 day a week, a volume load for that 1 day a week is about 20 reps. If you can, 15 to 25 reps is a good volume load for that. 25 to 30 is probably more an overreach volume load for that intensity. So that's maybe, I would probably shy away from over 25 reps at that intensity. I'd probably work within 15 to 20, 2 days a week. 15 to 20 is good. 3 days a week, you probably don't want to go over 20. It's probably a bit much. Probably look more to 10 to 15 at 3 days a week at that intensity rating. 90%, this is heavy enough that I wouldn't perform 90% loads more than once a week. I probably wouldn't perform 90% loads all that much in my training. And if I did, I'd flip-flop it. So I would maybe go a week where the heaviest load that gets handled is probably about 80 to 85%. And then next week it might go 90% or above. And I'd probably make sure the week after that then we didn't go over 80, certainly did not go over 85%, but we probably wouldn't go over 80% in that next week if we'd done any kind of significant lifting above 90%. A volume load for 90%, sort of your typical sort of 90% workouts, like the 3 sets of 3 workout. Anything over 10 is probably too much of an overload for 90%. Sort of 15 is getting a bit silly. If it's truly 90% of RM, then something like a 5 sets of 3 at 90% RM is, if it's true 90%, it's definitely going to create an overreach. And for one, you'd be lucky to be able to complete the workout. It's probably quite likely you won't be able to complete the workout. And two, if you were to complete the workout, then the quality of those reps would be probably very shoddy. So 90% needs to be used very sparingly. Something I might throw in, like 2 sets of 2 and 90% is probably as heavy as I would go. It's probably, if you look at it from a 1 day a week perspective, 2 sets of 2 and 90% is not that heavy a workout. It's not really a difficult workout. It can be completed quite easily, but within the context of a program, like a block, say a 4-week block, where there's an overload happening at some stage in the block, or the overload might be coming in week 1, 2, 3, or 4. Depending on where that overload's coming, then we need to start. And when I say where the overload's coming, if we have if our overload comes from volume load, we might have, so volume load is intensity or weight lifted times volume, which is number of reps, which in that week. The largest volume load could have happened on week 2, so week 1 was like an intro, week 2 is the overreach or the overload within the program, week 3 is like a lighter recovery sort of base week, and week 4 is like more of a stimulus week. So if that overload's coming in week 2 and we decide we're going to lift at 90% in week 3, then we're really putting ourselves prone to using incorrect form. And when the intensities are of that nature and we're using correct form, then the potentials for injuries are much greater, but probably more relevant to performance when we utilize incorrect technique with heavier loads. We induce far greater levels of fatigue than is necessary at that intensity. That higher level of fatigue is from using the incorrect technique, which causes knock-on effects, like using the lower back, like we stated earlier in the podcast, which causes us to take longer than we should do to recover from that session. And it also, with too much, it's very easy to create an overload or to create an overreach with such a high intensity. Anything from sort of 4 upwards is starting to create that sort of scenario, if it truly is 90%. I think a lot of programs, or a lot of people who program for people, throw percentages like 90% in willy-nilly, because it's not actually truly that percentage, because they haven't got like a tight rein on their lifters' capabilities. So I think you need to be careful when looking at programs online, because it's often the case people just throw around percentages without any real appreciation or any real grounding in where, 1, your capability is, and 2, what that actually means from an execution standpoint. So yeah, hopefully that's spoken. Like, there is no clean-cut answer to that question. I hope I've put that across. I hope you have a bit more of an understanding as regards how you might look at a program with the various variables in place, and how that might decide session to session the volumes that you're going to utilize at those percentages with that session. And also, it really does depend, as like a final caveat, it depends on the individual. I've got some lifters who can utilize quite high volumes, and other lifters who can't utilize very much volume at all. And your ability to handle volume can be trained, and that could be a goal of one part of the program. Could be to expose a lifter to the frequency or to the volume. So if you listen to the previous podcast 84, you'll recall the case study of the strong lifter who only started moving towards 2 times a week squat and deadlifting. That's a scenario where intensity and volume loads are very low for a period of 6 weeks, because the goal of the program is to allow that lifter to get used or to habituate to the new frequency of training, which then allows us much greater program variation, much greater program flexibility, in a scenario where we have more regular training stimulus, but also we have much more flexibility within our program, which allows us to induce better adaptation. So you have more adaptation windows through the week, whereas if we only train once a week in that lift, then we have only one adaptation window, which automatically slows our progress or automatically hamstrings what we can do. It definitely decreases immensely the amount of creativity or the amount of problem solving that we can utilize for that lift, because we only get one training instance. And where that might be scenario is if someone has a multitude of technical issues within the squat, but we only have one training a week, then we're in a scenario where we have to choose: do we want to get stronger, or do we need to get more technically competent at the lift? And that's going to dictate the goal of the session. Whereas with 3 trainings in a week, then we can do both. We can catch both monkeys. And then finally, on the skill learning aspect, so if we look at something like a golf swing, or we look at something like kicking a ball, that's something that can be done repeatedly with the correct technique, or with a meaningful technique that can be done repeatedly over and over again. You can hit 1,000 golf. Well, I say 1,000 golf swings. We can maybe practice 150 golf swings with a meaningful cadence, with a meaningful technique, on a day-to-day basis, where recovery is not an issue because it's a low enough of a physiological demand on the body that we can recover realistically from session to session, from day to day, which increases our ability to achieve that sports mastery that so often gets talked about. Also within tennis, within football, and in these different sports, where the physiological demand of the sport-specific skill is of a low enough intensity that we can recover quickly. We can handle these larger volumes. We can do these we can do these higher levels of practice. We can do these higher volumes of practice. But when it comes to powerlifting, it's probably more relevant when it comes to weightlifting, there are more variables than just performing the movement. Now, it depends on where we are as a lifter. Some lifters who are of a very low sport skill mastery, who can't achieve the correct technique in a squat with a barbell, for instance, something like performing 2 times a day using probably just the bar or something like that, perform the sport specific skill, will probably have a marked effect on their technique. They will probably, and with low enough intensity like 0 to 50%, that, or 20 to 30% say, that will be a low enough physiological demand that there's no real need for recovery. The recovery will happen overnight for that lift, and that will allow them to mimic meaningful sports execution or optimal sport specific execution, or in English, to be able to perform the back squat with a good technique. It might even do simple things like help them to develop the specific mobility they need within the ankle and the knee and the hip to be able to just to move through the range with a good technique. It might act as an active stretch or an active mobility session that will allow them to do that. Now, when we come into an intermediate to advanced lifter, where it then becomes irrelevant really what our skill execution is like with those intensities, because it doesn't carry over into higher loaded scenarios. So there is a study. I need to bring the study. I need to find the study again because I keep bringing it up. But there were 2 or 3 groups that trained at different percentages. Some trained at 70%. One group trained at 70%. One group trained at 80%. And one group trained at 90%. And I think it wasn't a jump squatting task. It was jump squat. It was a jump squat in the study, and then they tested 1RM squat and 1RM jump squat, or there were different. I don't think it was 1RM jump squat. It was ballistic variables like peak power output and stuff like that on jump squat to see what percentages had the best adaptation. What they showed within that study was that all groups became stronger, but they only or all groups improved their bar kinematics over like the 70%, 60%, 80% loads, but the only group that increased their bar kinematics at 90% plus was the group that trained at that intensity. There's a lot of things that go on within lifting weights that make it a poor parallel for sport skills like golf swings or kicking. The dynamics of the demand of the skill change with load is scalable. So, for instance, the easy one to utilize to explain this would be a snatch. So, with 50% RM, the kinematics or the variables of a lift are such that a lifter can pull the bar 2 meters in the air and catch it with no knee bend. But then when we go to 100% load, the lifter no longer has the strength or the ballistic ability to project that bar at 2 meters distance in the air. They're not strong enough to do that. Now they can achieve 1.20 meters of height that changes everything. That means that lifter now, the timing of that lift changes completely. The action of the arm pull or the shrug is now completely different. The action of the arm pull, the shrug now is to actually bring the lifter under the bar or help the lifter to get under the bar to catch that bar. And that new reduced height, because the intensities are higher. To get better at that scenario, those timings, that lifter needs to train with percentages that allow them to mimic that skill. So we're talking a power snatch and a squat snatch. Although the pulling mechanics of both movements are the same, the actual skills or the specific skills are wildly different. As such, it needs to be practiced with meaningful percentages. So a weightlifter will not become more, or at least an intermediate to advanced weightlifter will not become more proficient at squat snatching by training a 50% snatch once to twice a week. If they have a good level of skill mastery or sport mastery. In powerlifting, it's not necessarily an exact parallel because the timings and the skills don't change as wildly as they do within weightlifting. However, there still needs to be an element of that within our training. You can't really, like when you take 90 to 100% out, it does change your execution. Timings are different. You can't be lazy. Your setup needs to be tighter. You need to practice with the bar whip's different. Things are different with that heavier load. So I would say, if for a certain level of lifter, that kind of training, I'll probably say it's probably not going to help. It might help. It might help you iron a few things out. But I would say it needs to be, for the skill-specific practice within powerlifting to be relevant to your 1RM or your top end, it needs to be of a sufficient intensity, or it needs to be performed under a sufficient amount of fatigue. So that sufficient amount of fatigue might mean that if you're doing 70% weight, you might need to get 4, 5, 6 sets in to that session before things become more specific to that higher percentile weight, because your force capacity has reduced to a level where this is now relatively more of a demanding task, which requires us to adapt timings, coordinations that are more relevant to that 100% application. So I would say potentially probably not, because of the scalability and the change in skill execution in a loaded sport where we put weight on the barbell, where it becomes heavier. Okay, that's going to conclude the podcast. Hope you've enjoyed it. It's probably been one of the more in-depth podcasts I've done in a long while. Good question. Enjoyed answering it. If you're listening to this for the first time, please subscribe on iTunes if you're getting us from there. If you're on Facebook or if you're on YouTube, please give us a thumbs up, subscribe. If you have any topics you would like answered, please leave a comment below. If you'd rather send me an email or you want to contact me for any other reason, please shoot me an email to speedpowerperformance@gmail.com. Thank you very much for listening. I've been Mark, and I'll probably catch you again this week. Thank you very much for listening. I